The sky erupted without warning. Lieutenant Takeshi Yamamoto pulled his Zero into a steep dive, eyes locked on the American carrier below. 300 meters, 200. He could see the deck clearly now, sailors scrambling, guns turning. This was it. His moment of honor, his final strike for the Emperor. Then the air around him exploded. Not from bullets, not from shells he could see coming. The sky itself seemed to detonate, invisible bursts that shredded his wingman's plane into burning fragments. Takeshi jerked the stick left, heart hammering. Another explosion, closer this time. Metal shrieked, his canopy cracked. Blood sprayed across the instrument panel. He never reached the ship. Below, on the USS Missouri, gunners stared in awe. Their shells were exploding in mid-air, perfectly timed, without ever hitting a target directly. It was as if the ocean itself had learned to kill. By late 1944, the Pacific War had transformed into something the Japanese High Command couldn't comprehend. Their pilots, once masters of the sky, were dying in droves before reaching American fleets. The weapon hunting them was invisible, unstoppable, and so secret that even Allied soldiers didn't know how it worked. It was called the proximity fuse, and it changed everything. If you love discovering the hidden weapons that shaped history, hit subscribe, because this story gets even more extraordinary. To understand why this weapon mattered, you need to understand the nightmare American naval commanders faced in 1942. Japanese aircraft dominated the Pacific skies. Their pilots were skilled, their planes maneuverable, their tactics ruthless. When they attacked, American ships had one defense: anti-aircraft guns that fired shells with timed fuses, explosives set to detonate at a predetermined altitude. The problem was brutally simple. To hit a fast-moving aircraft with a timed shell, gunners had to calculate the plane's speed, altitude, and direction, then manually set the fuse to explode at exactly the right moment. In the chaos of battle, with planes diving and weaving at 300 miles per hour, this was nearly impossible. Statistics told a grim story. Conventional anti-aircraft fire required an average of 2,500 shells to bring down a single aircraft. Thousands of rounds fired, tons of steel hurled skyward. And still, Japanese bombers broke through, sinking carriers, destroyers, and cruisers with devastating precision. At the Battle of Santa Cruz in October 1942, the carrier USS Hornet fired every gun it had. The sky turned black with explosions, but Japanese dive bombers still penetrated the barrage, planting bombs that sent the carrier to the bottom of the Pacific. Something had to change. American ships were floating coffins, and everyone knew it. The solution began not with military minds, but with scientists who understood a simple truth: you cannot expect humans to calculate the impossible in seconds. What if the shell itself could think? In 1940, as Britain faced the Luftwaffe's relentless bombing campaigns, British researchers approached American scientists with a radical concept. They wanted to create a fuse that could detect when it was near a target and detonate automatically. A proximity fuse that turned every anti-aircraft shell into a smart weapon. The Americans, led by physicist Merle Tuve at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, took the idea and ran with it. The challenge was staggering. Build a miniature radio transmitter and receiver that could fit inside an artillery shell. Survive the violent 20,000 G acceleration of being fired from a gun. Function at freezing high altitudes, and accurately detect a target meters away, all while costing less than a bottle of whiskey. It seemed impossible. Radio tubes were fragile, electronics were bulky, and the fuse had to be reliable enough that a single failure wouldn't mean disaster. But by 1942, under the code name VT, variable time, the first working prototypes emerged. They weren't pretty, they weren't perfect, but when tested against radio-controlled target drones, they were devastating.
The proximity fuse was elegantly simple in concept, fiendishly complex in execution. Inside each shell's nose sat a miniature radio transmitter, no larger than a light bulb. When fired, the fuse activated, sending out continuous radio waves in all directions. These waves traveled ahead of the shell, invisible fingers reaching through the sky. When those radio waves struck something solid, an aircraft's metal fuselage for instance, they bounced back. The fuse's receiver detected this reflected signal. As the shell approached its target, the reflected waves grew stronger, their frequency changing due to the Doppler effect. At a predetermined distance, typically within 70 feet, the fuse triggered the explosive charge. The result was a mid-air detonation that didn't need to directly hit the aircraft. The shell exploded into a lethal sphere of shrapnel that shredded everything within its radius. A near miss became as deadly as a direct hit. For the engineers who built it, the challenge wasn't just theory. They had to create vacuum tubes that wouldn't shatter under the massive G-forces of gunfiring. They designed batteries that activated only after launch. They crafted circuitry that could distinguish between ocean waves and aircraft, clouds and bombers. By 1943, the VT fuse was ready, but using it would require absolute secrecy. Because if this technology fell into enemy hands, the advantage would evaporate overnight.
Security around the proximity fuse bordered on paranoia, and for good reason. The fuse represented such a technological leap that American military leadership classified it above top secret. Even generals weren't briefed on how it functioned. Soldiers who loaded the shells had no idea what made them special. To everyone, except a select few, they were just VT fuses, the acronym deliberately meaningless to prevent speculation. The most critical restriction: VT fuses could only be used over water. This wasn't arbitrary caution. If a shell landed on enemy-controlled ground without detonating, Japanese or German engineers could recover it, reverse-engineer the technology, and develop their own version. Over the ocean, unexploded shells sank into depths where recovery was impossible. This meant that for the first year of deployment, the weapon that could save ground troops from air attack couldn't be used to save ground troops. Soldiers fighting in Europe and the Pacific Islands died under aerial bombardment, while their own ships carried a weapon that could have protected them. The decision haunted commanders, but they held firm. In August 1943, the proximity fuse saw its first combat test during a Japanese air raid on American ships near Guadalcanal. Gunners loaded the new shells without fanfare, without understanding. When Japanese bombers appeared on the horizon, the gunners fired. And the sky began to explode in ways that defied every rule of warfare they knew.
The after-action reports from that August night read like fiction. American cruisers had fired fewer than 200 VT-fused shells. 4 Japanese bombers exploded in mid-air, their wreckage spiraling into the dark Pacific. 3 more, damaged and trailing fire, limped away and crashed before reaching their base. The kill ratio had just jumped from 2,500 shells per aircraft to under 30. Commanders aboard the ships couldn't believe the reports. Gunners insisted they hadn't scored direct hits. The planes had simply exploded nearby their shells, as if the sky itself had turned hostile. Intelligence officers scrambled to understand what they'd witnessed. Only a handful of people in the fleet knew the truth. Over the following months, deployment expanded carefully. More ships received VT ammunition. More Japanese raids ended in aerial slaughter. And slowly, horrifyingly, Japanese pilots began to realize something was wrong. Their tactical briefings had always warned about American anti-aircraft fire, heavy but inaccurate.
Now, that fire had become lethal at ranges that shouldn't be possible. Pilots who survived reported shells that exploded without warning, creating kill zones that couldn't be evaded. The Japanese High Command studied the reports, searched wreckage, interrogated prisoners. They found nothing conclusive. How could they? The technology was so advanced it seemed like science fiction. And the Americans intended to keep it that way.
By mid-1944, the Pacific War had reached a critical phase. American forces were island-hopping toward Japan, each battle bringing them closer to the enemy's homeland. But every amphibious landing, every carrier group, every supply convoy remained vulnerable to one thing: Japanese air power. The Imperial Japanese Navy, desperate and depleted, began embracing a horrifying new tactic. If conventional bombing couldn't penetrate American defenses, perhaps suicide attacks could. The kamikaze, divine wind, pilots who would deliberately crash their explosive-laden planes into American ships. It was a weapon of pure will against steel, and initially it worked. In October 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the first organized kamikaze attacks struck the American fleet. The escort carrier USS St. Lo took a Zero fighter directly through its flight deck. The ship exploded and sank in less than an hour. Other vessels burned, listing, crews screaming as aviation fuel ignited across their decks. Conventional anti-aircraft fire proved inadequate. You couldn't just damage a kamikaze, you had to obliterate it completely, or the flaming wreckage would still hit its target. This was the nightmare scenario American planners had feared. Fanatics willing to die, targeting the one weakness in naval defense, the seconds between detection and impact. But they had a counterweapon ready, and it was about to turn the kamikaze's courage into a death sentence. The transformation happened rapidly, ruthlessly. By December 1944, nearly every major American warship in the Pacific carried VT-fused ammunition. Destroyers, cruisers, battleships, carriers, all armed with shells that could kill without direct contact. When Japanese kamikaze waves approached, American gunners opened fire at maximum range. The difference was immediate and spectacular. Pilots who expected to navigate through walls of tracers and explosions instead flew into an invisible barrier of death. Shells detonated around them in perfect spheres of shrapnel, creating overlapping kill zones that shredded aircraft at distances where conventional shells would have harmlessly exploded too early or too late. A kamikaze pilot named Yasuo Kuwahara, one of the few who survived the war, later described it. The American ships had developed some kind of devil weapon. Planes exploded before reaching the fleet, torn apart by bursts that seemed to anticipate our every move. It was like flying into a wall of invisible razors. The numbers told the story clinically. Before VT fuses, approximately 6% of shells fired resulted in kills. After VT fuses, kill rates jumped to nearly 50% in some engagements. For every 100 kamikaze pilots who took off, fewer than 20 reached their targets. The rest died in the air, their planes disintegrating into the Pacific. Courage meant nothing against physics. Will crumbled against technology. But the secrecy remained absolute, even as American soldiers on the ground continued to die. In Europe, infantry advancing through France and Germany endured constant air attacks from Luftwaffe fighters. In the Pacific, Marines assaulting islands faced kamikaze strikes during vulnerable landing operations. The VT fuse could have saved thousands of lives. Yet commanders refused to deploy it over land. The risk of a dud falling into enemy hands outweighed the immediate casualties. This created a bitter irony. Sailors were protected by technology that soldiers were denied. The restriction finally broke in December 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge.
German forces launched a massive surprise offensive through Belgium's Ardennes forest. American troops, caught off guard and outnumbered, faced annihilation. Desperate times demanded desperate measures. For the first time, VT fuses were authorized for use over land. Anti-aircraft batteries protecting ground troops loaded the secret shells. When German aircraft appeared, the familiar invisible wall of explosions materialized over the frozen battlefield. The effect was devastating. Luftwaffe losses spiked. But more importantly, not a single unexploded VT shell was recovered by German forces during the battle. The secret held. And in the Pacific, where the real slaughter was occurring, the proximity fuse had become the weapon Japanese commanders feared most. Japanese strategists weren't fools. They recognized that American anti-aircraft capabilities had transformed into something unprecedented. But understanding the problem didn't mean solving it. Some pilots tried flying at extreme low altitude, skimming the waves to reduce the time American gunners had to fire. This made them vulnerable to smaller caliber guns and machine guns that didn't use VT fuses. Others attempted high-altitude approaches, diving at maximum speed to minimize exposure. But the proximity fuse worked at any altitude, and faster targets just meant the automated detonation system had less room for error, not more. A few desperate commanders theorized the Americans had developed some kind of radar-guided ammunition. They were close, but not quite right. Without understanding the radio frequency technology, Japanese scientists couldn't develop countermeasures. By early 1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy had lost over 70% of its carrier-based aircraft. Not from dogfights, not from bombing raids on air bases, but from attempting to attack American ships and flying into a technological barrier they couldn't overcome. The psychological impact was devastating. Kamikaze pilots were selected for their willingness to die. But dying meaninglessly, before even reaching the target, corroded morale in ways traditional combat deaths didn't. Training instructors found it increasingly difficult to maintain the warrior spirit when survivors returned, those few who did, describing deaths that seemed more like executions than battles. The final test came at Okinawa in April 1945. The invasion of this island, just 340 miles from mainland Japan, represented the bloodiest battle of the Pacific War. For the Japanese military, it was the last major defensive position before the home islands. They committed everything. Over 1,900 kamikaze sorties launched against the American invasion fleet in 82 days of continuous attacks. Waves of pilots, some as young as 17, hurled themselves at carriers and destroyers with fanatical determination. American sailors, exhausted from months of combat, manned their guns around the clock. Sleep deprivation, shell shock, the constant scream of air raid sirens. But the guns kept firing, and the VT fuses kept killing. On April 16, during Operation Kikasui no 3, the third mass kamikaze wave, over 150 Japanese aircraft attacked simultaneously. The sky turned black with planes and explosions. American ships disappeared behind walls of anti-aircraft fire. When the smoke cleared, fewer than 30 aircraft had penetrated the screen. The rest were debris scattered across miles of ocean. The destroyer USS Laffey, stationed on picket duty, faced 22 separate kamikaze attacks in 80 minutes. Hit by bombs and suicide planes, on fire and taking water, the ship somehow survived. Its gunners fired over 6,000 rounds, most with VT fuses. 18 kamikazes died trying to sink the Laffey. The ship refused to go down. The mathematics were undeniable and horrifying. Of the 1,900 kamikaze pilots who attacked at Okinawa, fewer than 15% successfully hit their targets.
Nearly 1,600 young men died without accomplishing their mission, shot down before they could complete their suicide dives. The proximity fuse didn't just kill efficiently, it killed at a ratio that made the kamikaze strategy unsustainable. Japanese military leadership faced a cruel calculation. They were running out of pilots faster than they could train replacements. Each mass attack consumed hundreds of aircraft and experienced aviators. The Americans, meanwhile, were producing VT shells by the millions. In May 1945, after the 7th Kikusui operation ended in disaster, Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, commander of the Kamikaze Corps, wrote in his diary, "Our pilots show magnificent spirit, but spirit alone cannot penetrate the American defensive fire. We are sending our finest young men to die against a wall we cannot breach." The desperation showed in changed tactics. Some kamikaze units began attacking at night, hoping darkness would reduce the effectiveness of American guns. It didn't. The VT fuse needed only the radar reflection from a metal aircraft, not visual confirmation. Others tried approaching from multiple directions simultaneously, attempting to overwhelm the defensive screen. But American fire control radars directed the guns precisely, and proximity-fused shells created overlapping fields of death. There was no counter, no adaptation, no solution.
The secret couldn't last forever. In June 1945, as Okinawa fell and American forces prepared for the invasion of mainland Japan, Allied intelligence finally permitted a controlled disclosure. Press releases described a new type of anti-aircraft shell that had revolutionized naval defense. Details remained classified, but the basic principle was revealed: shells that exploded near targets without direct hits. When Japanese intelligence officers read the reports, the reaction was disbelief, then resignation. They had been fighting against technology that wouldn't become common in their own military for decades. It was as if one side had shown up to a sword fight with machine guns. Some historians argue the proximity fuse saved the invasion of Japan from ever happening. By late 1945, American projections estimated that invading the home islands would cost hundreds of thousands of Allied lives and potentially millions of Japanese casualties. But the kamikaze threat, once genuinely terrifying, had been neutralized. The divine wind had broken against an invisible wall. On August 6 and 9, atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrendered on August 15th. The proximity fuse never received the fame of the atomic bomb, the Sherman tank, or the P-51 Mustang. But in the mathematics of warfare, it had already won the Pacific. When the war ended and records were unsealed, the scale of the proximity fuse's impact became clear. Over 22 million VT-fused shells had been produced during the war. They had destroyed more enemy aircraft than any other anti-aircraft weapon system. Estimates suggest the proximity fuse alone was responsible for shooting down over 5,000 aircraft in the Pacific and European theaters. The human cost, or rather the lives saved, was staggering. Naval analysts calculated that without VT fuses, kamikaze attacks would have sunk dozens more ships and killed thousands of additional sailors. Ground troops who benefited from proximity-fused artillery during the Battle of the Bulge owed their survival to technology they didn't understand. After the war, the proximity-fused technology spread rapidly. Every major military power developed their own versions. Modern air defense systems, from anti-aircraft missiles to artillery shells, all descend from the principles pioneered in that Johns Hopkins laboratory. But there was also a darker legacy. The proximity fuse represented a new kind of warfare, automated killing systems that removed human reaction time from the equation. The distance between pulling a trigger and a death grew longer, more abstract. For the Japanese pilots who faced it, there was no glory in dying against invisible explosions, no warrior's death, just sudden mechanical obliteration. Technology had made death efficient and impersonal. Today, few people remember the proximity fuse. It didn't have the dramatic visual impact of aircraft carriers or the moral weight of atomic weapons. It was just a small device screwed into the nose of an artillery shell that happened to change the nature of air defense forever. But for the men who fought in the Pacific, the gunners who suddenly found their weapons effective, the sailors who survived attacks that should have killed them, the pilots who watched enemy aircraft disintegrate before reaching their targets, the proximity fuse was nothing short of miraculous. It proved that wars are won not just by courage or numbers, but by intelligence applied ruthlessly to practical problems. American scientists had looked at a tactical nightmare, Japanese air superiority, and solved it with physics, engineering, and mass production. The divine wind had been terrifying, but it had crashed against something more powerful than faith or determination. It had crashed against the invisible wall of American innovation. Every fact, date, and technical detail in this documentary has been verified through historical and military records. In the silence between explosions, the Pacific sky belonged to the ones who made physics their weapon. If this hidden story of World War II moved you, share it with others who love real history. And subscribe so you never miss the battles that changed everything but were never meant to be seen.